Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ ولادي أبية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the programme. You may have noticed that I have done away with the ill-conceived artificial background from yesterday. This is following negative reports from various comrades regarding the fake bookcase background. So we're reverting to the good old-fashioned screen today, and I feel that that will probably be better. So, for those of you who missed it, today I saw the Ridley Scott directed movie Napoleon, and I have to say it is one of the worst pieces of cinematic excrement that I have ever had the misfortune to sit through. 2.5 hours of juvenile garbage, which I'll be going through in the review to be done on Patreon on Thursday. Needless to say, my thoughts on it are not favourable. I will confine myself for now to saying that this film is so abysmal, so bad, so poorly thought out, so poorly characterised. It's even badly lit. Even the lighting scheme is bad. So I've come to the conclusion that Ridley Scott is the most derivative and overrated filmmaker that Britain has produced in many, many years. The fact that he is praised at all is principally based on a couple of works which are genuinely good. So that's Alien, the original Alien, is a genuinely good film. It's basically a serial killer in space, with the serial killer being an alien. That's a genuinely good film. Needless to say, it's not written by him. It's written by Dan O'Bannon and others. And it comes originally from an idea conceived by John Carpenter and others, which was the satirical film Dark Star, which was a student movie in the early 70s. And, of course, he made Blade Runner, which the original of which is great. And, again, not his screenplay. He directed the visuals for that, and the visuals for that are fantastic, and that's still a fantastic film, enlivened but not just by the style but by the actors that he had working for him. So Blade Runner, also incredibly good film. Rest of his stuff, I mean, pretty much standard Hollywood fare, to be honest. Black Rain I've never really cared for. Someone to Watch Over Me is just standard mid-80s tripe thriller. Thelma and Louise, I don't get why anybody regards that as anything other than, again, just standard Hollywood stuff. Going into the 90s, trying to think. Gladiator has a good opening scene, but again, like, he's been using the same color palette for 20 years now, and that was the same color palette that he uses at the beginning of Gladiator, which is sort of dark and mournful. And the Gladiator was basically a rip-off of a film from the 60s, which is The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, with Christopher Plummer in it and a lot of other actors. And I think that Gladiator is a vastly overrated film. So more to come on this. And Muzzle Paint in the chat has mentioned The Duelists, which is quite good, but is also derivative. It's a rip-off. Duelists is a rip-off of a Polish movie, a Polish epic from the early 1970s and Polish socialist period, which goes by the name of Potop, which essentially has a lot of the same plot to it and is a far better film. All of which I will get to on Thursday, but I wanted to start off with that. Also, Muzzle Paint observes that Ridley Scott lost me with the propaganda piece Black Hawk Down. Yeah, Black Hawk Down is the most racist film since Birth of a Nation. I mean, you compare that to Zulu, for instance, the film Zulu, made in, I believe it's 1964, 65, which is shot on location in apartheid South Africa. So not exactly starting on a great point, by an American director, Cy Enfield, produced and I think co-written by the great Stanley Baker, who was in one of the greatest Manchester films of all time, by the way, Hell is a City. But so Michael Caine doing an impression of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and, you know, bold British lads holding the line against the ghastly Zulu. a pro-British Empire film, of course. Still not as racist as Black Hawk Down. In fact, the Zulus, at least, the Zulus receive far better, more respect and characterization than the Somalis do in Black Hawk Down. So as Irish Partisan says in the chat, Bondarchuk's Waterloo, far better film. I'll be reviewing that as part of the review on Thursday, by the way, is going to be a rather complex one because it's taking in Scott's Napoleon, Bondarchuk's Waterloo, also together with Bondarchuk's War and Peace, which is the definitive Tolstoy treatment. Also, I'm going to be comparing it to Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. So this is a watch list for the review coming up, and also Abel Gance's 1920s French silent movie version of Napoleon, which is a genuine work of art, really is. And if I've got time to watch it, I will also include the early 1950s Marlon Brando film Desiree, which I think does what Scott is trying to do here far better, and stars Marlon Brando giving a much better performance as Napoleon than whatever the fuck it was that Joaquin Phoenix was asked to do by Ridley Scott. So come to the show on Thursday for that one. I may need about 7 or 8 hours to go through all the things that are wrong. And then I may be on air for 24 hours on Thursday because it's going to take a hell of a long time. Morgan asks, how hard would it have been to make a good Napoleon biopic? Well, there have been some. I mean, like the Abel Gance silent movie is, again, it's a real work of early art, of early cinema, early cinematic art of the silent era. The Bondarchuk Waterloo isn't a biopic of Napoleon per se, but I'd argue that Rod Steiger gives, and again, like, he doesn't do the accent, he does it in comes and goes, but Rod Steiger portrays the charisma and complexity of Napoleon in the scenes he has with infinitely more gusto and believability than Phoenix. Like, for all that Steiger's Napoleon in that is crippled by anxiety and physical ailments and insecurity, and you see all his flaws in Steiger's performance, all Napoleon's flaws. You can also see the fact that he is a man of great knowledge, a man of great talent, a man of great charisma, and you can see in Steiger's careful in the performance, and the script is careful, and Bondarchuk's direction is careful to show that Napoleon in 1815 is not the Napoleon of 1805 or 1793. He's an older man, in some respects a more diminished man, and that comes across partly in the voiceover, that you get competing voiceovers from Christopher Plummer as Wellington and Rod Steiger as Napoleon in that, but also in the physicality of Steiger's performance, the way he holds himself, the way he reacts to things. You can see the charisma in that Napoleon Bonaparte undoubtedly had, that even his enemies at the time said he had, and that a man who can walk off a boat and do an appeal to a regiment of ordinary soldiers and win them over when they've been sent there to arrest or kill him, well, that's a hell of a guy. You've got to take that seriously. So Richard asks in the chat, would you see Phoenix played his role well? I would say that Phoenix is obviously doing what was asked of him. So I don't really blame him. I find the performance incredibly annoying, and frankly, I wanted to reach through the screen, pull him out of it, and beat his fucking head in. But that was the performance he's been asked to give. That's the performance dictated by the script, and his choices as an actor can be said yes or no to by the director. And bear in mind, one of the defenses of this film will be from its defenders, if there are any, that there's there's a 4.5 hour cut of it out there somewhere. To which I will say, but you released a 2.5 hour cut, which was a piece of shit. So if the answer is that there's a 4.5 hour version of the film, which is going to be released on Apple later, I think early next year or towards the end of this year, if that mends all the problems with it, then why the fuck did you release a 2.5 hour cut into cinemas? If it needs the full 4+ hours to make sense, then why don't you have some faith in your product, studio head, whoever you are, and release it in 2 parts? Release it as 2-hour movies. If you need 4 hours to tell the story, then take 4 hours to tell the story. Don't release a director's cut months later and say that that's the real one when you've stuck this fucking stinking corpse out into cinemas and charged people like £8 at least to see it. The film doesn't work on any single conceivable level. It doesn't work. And it's not just that the film's premise is reactionary. It's bad reactionary propaganda. I don't mind reactionary propaganda to watch. I mean, Jesus Christ, you can't turn on a TV program, an internet show, or anything else without seeing some kind of reactionary propaganda. There's things to appreciate. Those of you who've watched the program for a while will know that I am a very big advocate for John Wayne movies. But because the man who's so reactionary he'd turn your hair white. But I'll watch a John Wayne movie any day of the week over Ridley Scott's shit. Tim asks, was the visual appearance cinematography of the film the only redeeming element? No. To answer Tim's question directly, the visuals of the film were crap. They were awful. I mean, if I compare it to the Bondarchuk 1970 film, where, of course, Bondarchuk is working with, of course, a gigantic literal army of extras that were provided by the Soviet Red Army. It was shot in Soviet Ukraine. With the Battle of Waterloo painstakingly recreated. Well, I think he got about 20,000 actual Red Army soldiers to be in it, to be the armies concerned. If you compare it to the visual style of Bondarchuk, this just looks like the color palette is completely washed out. Even the scene, I mean, I don't even know why they bother with the French incursion into Egypt, because they're there for about 10 minutes and then he goes home because he feels that he thinks that his wife is making a cuckold out of him, which, by the way, is completely inaccurate. I'll go into this in more detail on Thursday, but they make so many things up in this film. And again, we get into the point about historical accuracy. How accurate do you have to be when you're telling a story about a figure like Napoleon? Well, in my view, invention is fine if the story you're telling is any good. But when you're inventing things to cram stuff into this ludicrous narrative that they've cooked up, which is, again, historically insulting, and not just to the memory of Bonaparte. I'm not a Bonapartist by any stretch of the imagination. I think that, as I've said before, like, if you want to do a film about the contradictions of the French Revolution and Napoleon, then do a film about the way that the Haitians defeated him. Make that film. Oh, and by the way, the war in Haiti, which Napoleon fought to try and restore slavery to what was to become Haiti, that's not mentioned at all. Like, there's a casualty list at the end, which again, I'll come to the purposes of this later, which mentions all some of the battles in Europe and the casualty list for reasons that I'm still working through. Haiti's not mentioned on that list. Presumably the Haitians that were killed and the Frenchmen that died fighting over there to restore the power of slaveholders weren't worthy of a mention of Scott and whichever other collection of dull-witted reactionaries that they got together to write and produce this thing. But to answer Tim's point directly, there's no redeeming feature for the cinematography. The cinematography is gash. The battle scenes are crap. I know that some people have said that the battle scenes are the redeeming element. No, they're not. The way that they portray Austerlitz is awful. It's again like it's gloomy to the point where you can't tell what's going on. Like they misrepresent the way the battle was fought. A lot. I know Scott said he didn't use a lot of CGI, but I can see that they use a lot of CGI in that scene. They use it to bulk out the crowds in the wide shots. So he does use a lot of CGI. The Battle of Borodino is portrayed for about 5 minutes. The invasion of Russia, probably the single most disastrous decision that Napoleon made, is dealt with in like 10 minutes flat. Like this gigantic piece of history, which changed probably the course of the history of the 19th century. These enormous battles that took place in the interior of the Russian Empire. The fact that Napoleon's army consisted not just of Frenchmen but of Prussians, all kinds of Germans from every kind of German state, Italians, Poles, like a whole. I think there were a few Irishmen there as well. Bulked out this huge army that was a sort of European invasion force. The fact that they don't cover anything about what made people follow him ever. They never really dwell upon, like, well, what kind of military leader was he? Why was he so revolutionary? Why was he able to beat all of the armies of Europe and Russia for years until, of course, they got the better of him? Why did he lose? That's not really covered either. Why was the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, able to overcome him in Portugal and Spain? Or overcome his generals, anyway. Like, there's so many interesting angles that you could have taken with this story. And there's no restrictions on what you could do with him, with this character. And there's that they choose to do this story in the way that they have is bizarre. And it's so bad, the plot is so bad that even reactionary British bourgeois historians, propagandists like Andrew Roberts, who's a complete reactionary, who's, lies about all kinds of things, even he found it too much. So yes, like for as Irish Partisan says in the chat, a remarkable figure, dead to over 202 years now, almost 203, and we're still talking about him. Like, he defined the period of the French Revolution. Let's not boil it down to one man, but the process through which he comes to power, through which he fought his wars, the wars of the French Revolution and the First French Empire, the way that they won, the way that they lost, the legacy of those wars within France and the legacy within Europe and the wider world. But the legacy in Europe leads ultimately to the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany. The second coming in the form of his nephew, Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III, who, of course, Marx and Engels scolded in very ribald terms in their writing, and very wittily as well. But again, like, the name of Bonaparte is such an enormous thing in French and European history, and so it deserves a proper treatment, and this really isn't it. And I've been to the tomb of Napoleon in Paris. Perhaps some of you have as well. And it's this enormous mausoleum. You feel like you can feel the weight of all the history associated with the events and the man when you go there. And yeah, it deserves a real cinematic treatment, which it has kind of been given before. There's been a lot of movies which the character of Napoleon has been in, but this really wasn't anything. This wasn't what was needed at all. I mean, I don't know who the audience for this is, because if even British reactionaries don't like it, and presumably it's made for them, then I can't see who is going to like it. To me, it was so bad, it reminded me of Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. I'll get to that and the reasons why on Thursday. Okay, so I'm going to get on to the real reason that I started this live stream rather than doing an advanced preview of a movie review, because I've yet to complete the research for Thursday. That's why I'm not going into it fully now. So, DE, hello to you. We're going to go through the chat and say hello. Muzzle Pain, good evening. Slava, good evening. And Richard, Lord Charfield, Will, Austin, Ian Foster, President Jesus. President Jesus, I've watched The Last Duel. It was shit. You're better off watching Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I mean, I do not understand why Scott has this reputation, because he's been turning out crap for 20 years or more now. Like there was the Exodus movie that he did, Exodus Gods and Kings, which was just fucking dreadful. I mean, you got like Joel Edgerton, an Australian guy in eyeliner, playing the Pharaoh. I mean, which could have been excused if the film was good, but it wasn't. That dreadful Robin Hood movie he did, where Russell Crowe did a different regional accent for each word that he pronounced. Yes, DE is right. Bill and Ted's depiction of Napoleon is far superior. Go and watch the Keanu Reeves version, you know. So, also hello to Georgi, an Irish partisan, of course, a comrade in Minsk. Morgan and Dan Kovalik's here. Good evening to you, comrade. And right, Morgan says, if you're unfamiliar, one of the best stories I've ever heard was Dan Carlin's epic on Alexander the Great's mother, Olympia. Her life and the time she lived in would have made a great, excellent series. Very interesting point. His original tomb in his house where he died is preserved on St. Helena. Very interesting. Hello to Tony. Arnold Saxnusium, who says, nice to see a film that's historic. Well, historically bad, in this case. Right, away from the cinematic excrement served up by Mr. Ridley Scott. Oh, sorry, Sir Ridley Scott. You got to kiss some serious ring to get that title. And the reason why I'm doing this stream tonight was to talk about the war in Ukraine and what's going on there. Also, recent speech by Putin at the summit held called the World Russian People's Council recently. Body set up by Yeltsin in the 90s. Putin's appearance at it, of course, is significant for what he says about the current situation. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about the Ukraine war tonight is partly because with everything that's been going on with regard to the war in Gaza or the war in occupied Palestine, there's not been much of a chance to go into it in greater depth. So I did go through the Harold Kuyat report last week, so catch up on that if you can. But I wanted just to dive into some details that are emerging over the last couple of days. And that is partly around Avdiivka, where the Russians continue to advance, and there's more stories coming out of whole Ukrainian rumors of whole Ukrainian battalions surrendering. There's more stories about how like the average age for some units is 54 years old. There's now multiple and confirmed reports of at least 160 women being killed on the front line. And this is, of course, the sign of the Ukrainian, or shall we say the NATO army that's made up of Ukrainians, running out of men, running out of resources, and running out of time. So the question is, well, one that we keep asking ourselves, and that we've been coming back to over and over again, which is, how does this end? Now, what's become... I'll rephrase that. What I have said for a long time, and I remember first saying this at the point where it was like April of last year, where it was obvious that the war was going to continue. What the plan of the American imperialists actually is, and it's changed, of course. Their ultimate plan, as we covered this in the last episode where we talked about this in detail, their ultimate plan was to use this as a regime change opportunity. That has failed. Putin's not going anywhere. Chances are, this is unconfirmed, but chances are he will run again, and he'll win very easily for the Russian presidency. So that has plainly hit the buffers in a major way. So the American imperialists now know that they've got no chance. Some of them want to try and pause the conflict in order that they can rebuild the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russians aren't going to go for that because the Russians know exactly what the plan is there. And the constituency within the ruling circles in Russia that would have been more of a comprador element, more of a pro-US alliance element, that constituency is very much diminished in power to the point where it has almost no influence now, it would seem. So the Russians aren't going to bail the Americans out of the hole that they've dug for themselves by agreeing to a pause. The Russians are going to end this on their terms, and in the end it will have to be some kind of agreement made between the United States and the Russians. At the moment, the Biden gang are trying desperately to get the Ukrainians to essentially admit to defeat so they don't have to. But that's going to probably change at some point. So what is the American plan? And notice I'm only talking about the plan of the US imperialists because Europe doesn't matter. Europe can't sustain this war on its own. If the US pulls out, it's over for Europe too. Europe is, at this stage, unworthy of consideration as anything other than an appendage of the US empire. They have no independent existence anymore. I have made the argument before that they haven't since at least 1945, arguably earlier if you want to dive into just how much debt the US was holding over the heads of the British and the French after World War One, and the Germans ultimately. Well, we won't digress any further. But the point being, we have to ask the question of what is the plan of the US imperialists now. If Avdiivka goes, then that's a major, major defeat for the US imperialists and the Kiev regime, and it opens up the way to further advances. Now, I want to return to a point that's been made before, but it's important, and it's the point that the Russians still have hundreds of thousands of men in reserve that they haven't deployed yet into the battle lines. The fighting being done in Avdiivka is still largely being done by units that were formerly of the Donbass militias, the next People's Republic militias. So they have 300,000 at least, which they've not brought into the field, and many more on top of that from the huge numbers of recruits they've taken into the Russian army. So by the time they get ready for their advance, they will have, according to most, again, these are Russian estimates I'm working off, around about 1 million men that they could conceivably use. I doubt they'll use all of them. So what are they planning to do with them? I think that there will be no dramatic advances. This is where my prediction bites me on the arse, but I don't think they'll go for a dramatic advance in the winter. I think they'll continue to grind away at killing as many of the Ukrainians as possible who still want to fight. And they will continue to solidify their position, bring all their forces behind the lines up to the same level of training and equipment standards. And then they will probably wait until spring of next year when things have dried out before making their final moves, shall we say. And where is the final move going to go to? I think that there's still the tendency of at least of Putin himself and others to see if, when it becomes clear that they cannot possibly win, they want to see if the Ukrainian forces will just collapse of their own accord. When it becomes clear that you can't win a war, you can't hope to even resist for too long when the average age of your troops keeps creeping towards 60, and that the rest of the trenches are filled up with teenage boys and women. And this, I think, what the Russian command, what the Russian civilian command wants to do, is to wait through the winter to keep grinding away to see if they can trigger a mass surrender and domino effect collapse across the Ukrainian front line in order to essentially not need to go for big advances down the coast to Odessa and into Kiev, because, of course, that would mean many more casualties if the Ukrainian forces are still intact enough to resist. I think the Russian political leadership would prefer to see as I said, a domino motion-like collapse of surrenders and desertions to make the Ukrainian army essentially evaporate. For various reasons, I don't think they're going to get that. I think that the fascist forces have been painted into a corner. They're now stuck. They can't get out. For them, surrender only means a long trip to a Russian prison, if they're lucky, if they're not just finished off on the spot. And they won't want to surrender, or exile and roaming the world as a mercenary for the CIA, or living in decreasing and deteriorating economic circumstances in exile in Europe or the United States in an increasingly bitter state. The future does not bode well if you're a Ukrainian fascist. And for those men, they have every reason to carry on, because there's no, so it's death or immiseration for them, and imprisonment. So for those ideologically committed men, those men who've committed an awful lot of crimes, which many of them have, they have every motivation not only to continue fighting, but also to try and ensure that everybody else does as well. That's why they're used as the disciplinary units, because they're desperate. There's no glory for them. There's only death or imprisonment awaits them. So they're going to keep going, and they're going to try and make sure everybody else does as well. So we can expect also Zelensky, if he survives, or whichever character replaces him, to largely continue on the same path, because all of these men are guilty. That in the military high command, Zaluzny is probably more guilty of crimes against the population of the Donbass than Zelensky is. Zaluzny's been in the power structure longer than Zelensky. He has every motivation to carry on, unless, of course, is it possible that he could cut some kind of deal with the Russians? Not anymore. I think 18 months ago, the Russians thought that either he or other people inside the Ukrainian military command could have been counted upon to stage a coup. That never materialized for various different reasons. I think the Russians miscalculated there. So here we get to what the American imperialists want, though. What the American imperialists want is, first of all, they would like to pause the conflict to enable regrouping on their side. And that's not going to happen. If they can't get that, then they'd like to just continue the war and do so by mobilizing as many people in Ukraine as possible. Teenage boys, women, men over the age of 50, 60. There's even been 70-plus-year-olds turning up. Anybody who can still put one foot in front of the other and hold a gun is going to probably end up being mobilized and sent to the front. And this is, ironically enough, of course, the Ukrainian leadership always accuses the Russians of doing what it itself is doing. So when Zaluzny says, well, I would have won, but I didn't know that Putin had so little regard for human life and that the Russians didn't have any regard for their casualties, that's what you might call psychologically giving yourself away, because it's Zaluzny who has no regard whatsoever for Ukrainian casualties. If anything, like Putin and the Russian command are very concerned to keep the number of casualties to a minimum, and have demonstrated a commitment to that for various reasons, some of which is to do with political survival, by the way. But Zaluzny and co. Have displayed no consideration for Ukrainian casualties at all, and still don't. So there's every chance that they are desperate enough and contemptuous enough of the lives of Ukrainians to send millions more to die, to prolong this war in order to save themselves, and save themselves via preserving their exit route. For their exit route runs to the United States. And the United States government, the US imperialists, want to continue this war, one, to avoid looking as if they've lost, to keep the war going so they can keep a plausible deniability in the air to say, well, you know, Ukraine is still fighting, Ukraine is still going, we can't rule them out yet. We're going to continue to support them right to the end until they either get beyond the presidential election, in which case if they win, they can stop worrying and let it die. Or if Trump wins and Trump cuts off the aid, then they can pin the whole thing on him and it won't matter anymore. At the moment, their concern is to try and keep it going. What they'd like to do is to keep it going and keep it going for as long as possible, force the Russians to fight for every single centimetre of Ukraine, force the Russians to go all the way to the Polish border, fighting them every step of the way, and then run a insurgency/terrorist campaign against Russian forces when the formal army is defeated, and never admit to having lost, never sign any kind of treaty with the Russians, never recognize Russian authority over the newly occupied formerly Ukrainian territories. That's what the American imperialists have wanted to do from day one. I will recall you, I will call your attention to the comments of Hillary Clinton, who, when the Americans actually fought, they miscalculated that the Russians were going all in, piling in, and were going to take out Kiev in a matter of days. The Americans were delighted, in a sense, because they thought they'd get to run a long and bloody insurgency, that they thought they could use that to destabilize the Putin government. However, both they miscalculated and the Russians miscalculated, and each other's miscalculation managed to create the war that we have now. So the plan is just to keep it going, as long as they can, to keep feeding weapons and money into Ukraine at a rate which keeps the Kiev regime, whether it is run by Zelensky or somebody else, going, to keep its authority intact, to keep it afloat for as long as possible, to make the Russians sacrifice as much as possible, to make the Russians spend as much as possible, to, in the vain hope, keep the sanctions on in the hope that somehow they'll start working, even though they're not going to, even though they have managed to produce for the Russians the new economic model that Putin was sort of muddling towards anyway, and now they've speeded up the process for that enormously. But their only hope is just to keep it going. And in that they are, of course, followed by their European vassals, all of them. And they are followed by the leaders of the Kiev regime, who are prepared to sacrifice everybody and anybody, it would seem, to this war for the purposes of preserving their own position and preserving their own exit routes, because that's all it's really about now. The US imperialists represent the likes of Zelensky, Zaluzny, Danilov, and others, and Yermak and all the others around the top end of the Kiev regime. Their only escape is to the United States. So that will be, they need to keep the US on side, and they need to do what the US says. Otherwise, there's no escape. Otherwise, it's caught by the Russians and put on trial, or killed by angry Ukrainians. Now, I'll pause for further comments. CJ, hello to you. Apparently he's listening on the way home from work. Irish Partisan says approximately 150 Ukrainians surrendered near Avdiivka yesterday, and I would hope that more will. If Ukrainians can possibly surrender in as large a numbers as possible to just end the war that way, that would be the best way that this could go now. Irish Partisan adds that the Duran said that when Avdiivka falls, Zelensky could go in a coup. Also, Makura stated that the US plans to bail and leave Europe with the baby. I've heard that, and I wouldn't be surprised if some in the US imperialists were thinking, well, fuck it, we'll leave it to the EU. There's two problems with that, though. The US imperialists are the only ones, the EU can't do this, that can keep the lights on in the for the Kiev regime in terms of supporting it via monetary infusions to keep the government going. The EU does not have the resources to do that. Does not have the ability via the fact that the dollar is the international reserve currency and all that that brings to the United States. The EU and the euro don't have the same weight for a variety of reasons. And so if their plan is to bail and leave it on, for Ursula von der Leyen and Joseph Borrell and Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron to run things, well, that bunch are going to crash Ukraine inside about 5 minutes. So, yes, I'm sure that there are some in the White House who are thinking leave it to the Europeans, but I don't think that that would be where it ends. I think that the American imperialists, and particularly the Biden crew, who are running things at the moment, the more cynical of them, will want to put enough money in to make sure that Kiev can stagger through the next few months. I think eventually they may just turn it over to the Europeans, but that's a very risky thing to do because that the Europeans might, the EU might be still a popular thing inside, the more foolish parts of the Ukrainian population. But in comparison to the abilities of the American imperialists to sustain the Ukrainian governmental operation, the EU's not got that capacity, and everybody knows it. So if the US pulls out, that, in my view, would trigger a crisis of confidence in the Kiev regime. If the US keeps paying the bills for at least another few months, then but turns the management of it over to the EU, then that might be a stopgap solution that avoids a collapse and gets the US out from more visible contributions. But even so, the US starts distancing itself. That's a big blow to the Kiev regime, which it might not recover from. So we'll see how realistic a plan that is. RVA Klavik says, hello, all comrades from Detroit. Well, good evening to you over in Detroit. Tony says, why hasn't there been an attempted coup in Ukraine by the army to save their people? Do you think if Israel begins their assault again that a regional war is inevitable to save Gazans? Two questions there. So let's deal with the first one. There hasn't been a coup in Ukraine because one of the first things that was done by the Kiev regime and its NATO handlers was to purge all oppositional elements in the army. So any officer who was old enough to have come up under the old Soviet system, who had connections with the Russian military, who was regarded as pro-Russian or not fascist enough, was purged. The army was reconfigured with a political test being put in place for the senior ranks. So the senior ranks have been politicized, and it's been made sure of, as far as they can, that the senior ranks are all pro-fascist. Excuse me. So the reason why you don't have a coup is because they've successfully purged the army. The political policing system is very effective at keeping dissent to a minimum. The army has committed so many crimes against the Russian population that its commanders are even more guilty than Zelensky for the crimes committed against the people of the Donbass from 2014 to 2022. So the army commanders are up to their necks in blood, even more than the civilian leadership is. So they have no ability now to cut a deal with Moscow. The only deal that would be offered to them would be surrender. And if they just surrender, then the fascists in the Kiev regime and the army will probably turn on the army commanders and try and kill them. And if they stage a coup and try and run the war themselves, then they'll end up losing anyway, which is what they would probably prefer. So these are men who've painted themselves into a corner, to answer Tony's question. There's no way out for them. And as for saving the lives of their people, allow me to be completely blunt. Fascists don't really care about the lives of the people of any nation. Not really. I know that fascists come out with long-winded statements about blood and soil and honour and defence of the fatherland, but this is all bourgeois junk. In the end, look at the final statements of Hitler, the man himself, the failed Austrian watercolor artist. What did he say when confronted with his own failures? He said that the German people had failed him. Him, the great genius, Frederick the Great with a better mustache, and the man who Germany didn't deserve in the end because his genius was too great. He said that the German people had failed him and deserved their fate. And that's how all fascists think. They don't regard the nation the way that communists do. For communists, the nation is the people, the masses, the proletariat, the peasantry. That's what makes up the nation. Because the proletariat is the future ruling class. It is the country. It through the labours of this class and its ancestors has laboured to create everything about the nation. It is the class that will inherit the earth. And so for us, the nation is the masses. And what is good for the masses is good for the nation. And the masses take the nation forward because of the historically progressive and revolutionary role that the proletariat has to play in the renewal of the nation and the saving of the nation. And so for us to throw lives away in a war that has no purpose other than to keep the nation under the thumb of the US imperialists, that's monstrous. Now, I don't want to mix anybody up here because someone may come back at me and say, yes, but the USSR sacrificed an awful lot to win World War II. And yes, an awful lot of Soviet nationals and many other nationals died to defeat Nazi Germany. But that was in a state that was a workers' state. And the reason why the working class and peasantry of the Soviet Union fought so hard and for so long and was willing to sacrifice so much is not like that reactionary buffoon Douglas MacGregor says because of Soviet terror. It's because they knew that they owned the country, that the country was theirs, that they had shaped the nation via their labours, that they were the ones whose labours had created the vast feats of industrialization. They knew that they were the rulers of the state and the masters of it. And that is why there was such unity and such a degree of red patriotism, shall we say, displayed by the Soviet masses to defend their nation because it really was theirs. Whereas the fascist is trying to restore the rule of the bourgeois, or in the case of the Ukrainian fascists, trying to maintain the rule of a completely degenerate Ukrainian ruling class that has completely and utterly failed to do anything progressive for 30 years. They've just looted and destroyed the nation. And so the basis of Ukrainian fascism is the defense of the people like Kolomoisky, who have just looted and asset stripped for 30 years, and to defend US imperialism and their hold over Ukraine. So on that basis, is it any wonder that people like Zaluzny and the other military commanders, who we have to assume, because they're all worn the swastika, they've all got the Bandera busts in their office, they all do the famous salute, that they are ideologically committed to that cause, then the class point of view behind that is one that regards the ordinary, I don't like to use the word ordinary actually, regards the Ukrainian proletariat, the everyday person, man or woman in Ukraine, as completely disposable, as, to use the words of the Duke of Wellington whilst describing his own soldiers, as scum, as completely disposable. And the attitude of the US imperialists is the same. Their attitude hasn't changed, and this is the same is true for the British, the French and the German ruling classes. Their attitude towards workers hasn't changed in over 100 years, since World War I. What's changed is their ability to mobilize their own populations for this slaughter. That ability has gone. They don't have the ability to mobilize for wars of aggression anymore. That has what has changed forever since the days of the Russian Revolution, the effects of the Russian Revolution that are still with us, and the effects of the American defeat in Vietnam, which are still there with us today, is that it has put the fear of God into the imperialists. They are terrified of the idea of having to mobilize their own population for war. It's the reason why they've not done it. Because one of the reasons why they've not done it. There's a lot of other reasons which I could go into in a future episode. But that's my rather long-winded way of addressing Tony's question. The reason why they don't do it is because the commanders of the Ukrainian military are fascist scum who don't love Ukraine. They are fighting for Ukraine's subordination to the United States. They are overseeing the vast destruction of the Ukrainian population in order to preserve the power of a group of parasitic oligarchs and the power of US imperialism. And because that is the class basis upon which they are fighting, they regard the Ukrainian population as completely disposable. I cannot describe and still remain on YouTube what I would do with the likes of Zaluzny, but I will refer you to the fate of General Wilhelm Keitel and others met at the end of the Nuremberg trials, because that's the only fate that Zaluzny deserves. Him and Zelensky and all the others, and they should be and their fate should be conducted in a way similar to those found guilty at Nuremberg, because their crimes, not just against the people of Donbass, but against the entirety of the Ukrainian population, are vast and almost beyond counting. And so if the Russians get their hands on them, which I doubt they will, I think they'll be fled long before that, but they should be put on trial for all of their crimes, and they should face the ultimate sanction for that. Second part of Tony's question. Do you think if Israel begins their assault again that a regional war is inevitable to save Gazans? I think that if Israel begins its assault again, it will be possibly the beginning of the end of Israel. To answer Tony's question, yes, the Israelis have been able to inflict a lot of bloody, savage deaths in Gaza. That much is beyond doubt. They're now saying 20,000. What's also coming out, though, is that the Israeli losses have been very large. I mean, I saw one number, I've mentioned it before, Lebanese media reported at least 3,000 dead, and an increasing number of desertions from the front line now being confirmed from sources inside Israel itself, that they keep getting ambushed, that many Israeli soldiers keep dying, that many more are horribly wounded, that it's a death trap in Gaza, that they don't actually control very much at all, that they've barely even put a dent in Hamas's or the Palestinian Liberation Forces military strength, and they've killed a lot of civilians. Yeah, they've committed a lot of crimes, but on the ground they're militarily losing the battle, and they've barely even engaged the Palestinian forces yet. So I think one of the reasons why this pause has been extended is that they're not winning. Not only are they not winning, but the situation is getting worse for them. And the US imperialists know that, which is why they're now desperately trying to find a way out of it. So if it kicks off again, yes, there will be more bombing. Yes, there will be more bloody destruction. There will be more horrifying images of the murder of children being flashed in front of our eyes. But always remember that when it actually comes down to the fighting, the Israelis are losing. And never forget that, because that's the reality. And I will be very interested to see how the US imperialists force them out of this now. Because the US imperialists will know via their intelligence sources and via the leaks out of the Israeli military just how bad it is, which is why Blinken is over there right now desperately trying to find a way out for them. And they're more than prepared to sacrifice Netanyahu to try and get out of it, but what political force the US imperialists can put in power in Tel Aviv, I don't know. Because there's no real stable government there in the offing that can survive more than about 5 minutes. So more problems for Israel, basically. Irish Partisan says, Military Summary Channel now saying that Kiev will be using private recruiting companies from the West to help with the mass conscription of anybody from 17 to 60, basically anybody who can hold a rifle. Just to clarify what you're saying there, Irish Partisan, are they trying to use like private recruiting companies to round up Ukrainians in the West who've fled? because that's going to be pretty fucking desperate. And the more this goes on, the more, if they're going to try and hunt these Ukrainians in the West down to try and force them to go home and die, the more of these people are just going to go underground and flee and do anything to avoid going back to Ukraine. Because quite frankly, if I were Ukrainian, the last thing I would want to do is go and die for this regime. Why would you? Czech PM Petr Pavel said last week that Europeans must prepare for a major war in Europe. Well, he can say what he likes. How's the Czech industrial base looking these days? Not good. If you look at the interview that my comrade Joti Bra did with Josef Skala, the Czech communist, he outlines in that the Czech industrial base has basically disappeared. So how is former General Pavel going to manage a war against the Russians when the Czech industrial base can barely even resupply the current Czech army as it stands? How's the Polish industrial base going to do? Or the Bulgarian? Or the Romanian? Or even the German? The fact is that these people can have all these reactionary fantasies about, leading a new war against the Russians. They haven't got the means to do it. They don't. They don't have the industrial base. They don't have the economic strength. They don't have the necessary political authority within their own countries to call up the necessary army they would need to summon up in terms of numbers to fight the Russians, nor do they have the means to supply it. They can't do it. And the Russians aren't going to give them the opportunity to do it either. I strongly suspect that what will happen in the end is that the Russians will take all of the Odessa coast. They'll end up taking and absorbing Transnistria as well, seeing as Sandu has abandoned it, apparently, into a vain pursuit of EU membership. They'll take Kiev, but I think they will leave Western Ukraine for a while as a trap for the Poles to fall into. A trap that they hope the Polish reactionaries will find irresistible. So this doesn't work. This plan that all these foaming at the mouth European reactionaries have, they'd need 5 years at most, at least, to get their industrial bases in order before they could fight any such war. So this is economic reality catching up to these people. All their fantasies mean nothing when confronted with the fact that this Czech economy, this Polish economy, this Italian economy, this German economy, this French economy, and the fucking British economy, these finance and service-based economies with very low or no industrial productive capacity in them, that are heavily reliant on a Chinese supply chain anyway. How are they going to mobilize all that to try and re-equip these huge armies that they would need and send them off to war on the Eastern Front? It's bullshit. Pavel is a bullshitter. The Warsaw reactionaries are bullshitters. They're not going to do it because they can't possibly win. And also, the US imperialists wouldn't back them either because they know that they can't do it. This is the thing. These people can fantasize on their, maybe Pavel was playing Risk and thought he'd found a great way to win. But again, they can't escape the industrial reality here. So let's carry on. Fascists always sell out their country, says Arnold, and Arnold is right. Greetings to Michael Hodgson in a chilly London, Ontario. Looter says, what's wrong with looting? Open question to the floor. Muzzle Paint says, do you think Israel can really escape war crime consequences at this point? I understand that the USA may shield them from formal trials or tribunals. It's an interesting question. I know there's been a lot of talk about this, but until the American protection is withdrawn from the Israeli commanders and the rulers of the Israeli state, then there's no way anybody's putting them on trial. If, however, the Israeli state implodes and these people have to run for it, then maybe at some point in the future. I mean, the mere fact that Erdogan's a blowhard and a bullshitter, but the fact that they're putting together cases to send to the International Criminal Court, which will never be heard. The US will try and invade it if it ever did such a thing. But the fact that that's now become common currency is tremendously damaging for the Israeli image anyway. So they may not face trial for this, but the consequences will be long-lasting and devastating nonetheless. Everybody in Ukraine to be mobilized via private recruiters. Isn't this basically like some kind of like, I'm trying to think of the right analogy here, historical comparison. Isn't this basically like the good old days where like recruiting parties used to go around Britain, like clubbing people over the head for the king's army and delivering them to the local earl who'd pay them a few silver coins to say, look, we've got this many men, we'll payment by results. I mean, it's very feudal the way this is going. The problem is there is no way out for a healthy man in Ukraine. Yeah, that's from Slava. Well, the only way out I can see, I mean, there are, of course, ways out. Criminal gangs offer ways out. Not that that's a reliable way of doing it, and I wouldn't recommend anybody try it. I mean, I don't know for sure enough to say, like, with certainty on this, but the only way out for Ukrainians that get press ganged, basically, is to try and surrender to the Russians as quickly as possible. Like, that's the only way out. Like, the Russians treat Ukrainian prisoners far better than Ukrainian commanders treat their own soldiers. And I've seen that from many different sources now. I'm not just repeating the Russian claim there. You can see it from the fact that there's now, 10,000 Ukrainians fighting under the Russian colours at least. Bottom line is that whatever the Russian government is or is not, it's living up to Putin's rhetoric about Ukraine and Russia being a brotherhood, being brotherly nations, far better than the Ukrainian rhetoric about glory to Ukrainers. So I think the best chance for people who are mobilized is find that Russian frequency that they're running, that channel whereby you can surrender on, and getting over to the Russian line as quickly as possible. Easier for me to say than for anybody in Ukraine to do. I'm fully aware of that. But a quick surrender is, I think, the only way out now, it would seem. Unless, of course, the Ukrainian state implodes, which we should all hope for, and the war stops as a result. Irish Partisan says, Belarus and Russia are the only countries in Europe that have largely kept their industrial base. Belarus is practically self-sufficient in many areas, including food and heavy industry, which is why the West hates Lukashenko, by the way, because Lukashenko and the government there stood in the way of the despoiling and looting of Ukraine, and that's what the Tikhanovskaya and the Western puppets stood for. There's no term of abuse strong enough to describe such people. If you look at what's happening to Ukraine now and you correctly recoil in horror at what the Ukrainian compradors have done, they would have done the same to Belarus if they'd have succeeded in their coup attempt in 2020. We should all thank the Almighty, or thank whatever God you believe in, or thank Lukashenko himself that he was able to withstand it. Tim says, isn't the European war drumbeat more to do with the present US regime in reality? Doesn't this all change after November the 24th? Possibly. I mean, Tim, I'll need to consider your question more before I give a definitive view on that one. I think that there's a lot of agendas being exercised at the moment. One of the fears of the European reactionaries, and this has been expressed many times, also in works of fiction, by the way, is that the US at one point is going to pack up and go home. And this was true in the Cold War. They were always afraid of this, like German, British, and French reactionaries. Maybe not the French as much back in the day, but the Italian reactionaries certainly were always afraid that the US was going to get sick of things, pull the plug on NATO, that an isolationist was going to get into the White House and say, this is, President Ron Paul would come along and say, this is costing us too much. I'm pulling the plug. We're going back to the 1776 original intention behind the Declaration of Independence and fuck the empire. Of course, it wasn't a realistic prospect. But there's always that fear amongst European reactionaries that the US is just going to give up on Europe, because it's quite a realistic fear in some respects, because without the US, they wouldn't have been saved from domestic revolution. And without the US now, it's not really about a threat from Russia. It's about the fact that the US has underpinned the power of the European bourgeoisies for 78, almost 79 years now. That's what they're really afraid of. They're afraid of their own populations because the US has acted as their reactionary guarantor for decades. Press gangs in the UK, says Muzzlepaint, correct. Irish Partisan says Belarus also produces consumer goods, cars, TVs, refrigerators, laptops, computers, kitchen items, etc. And will be economically strengthened by their increasing number of partnerships with the Chinese, of course. Let's not forget that. Mallard says, fascism and eco-activists have that in common. They care more about nature than people, misanthropy. Hey, if Hitler was around today, he'd be in Extinction Rebellion. He'd be gluing himself to an opera house somewhere. Tony says, America picked a fight with Russia via Ukraine, fell asleep to watch Hamas pile on Israel. The third front opens up, such as North Korea. Will USA finally lose their superpower status? Well, I'll go you on better, Tony. I'll say, what if a revolution breaks out in occupied South Korea, which, according to people who've been there and have studied it and have spoken to comrades in occupied South Korea, it's far closer to a revolutionary situation there than any of us know about. Notice how we never get any news from South Korea, or very little, through the bourgeois press. Apparently that's at least partly because there's a real threat of revolution there. So the whole question of what's going to happen next could be interesting if South Korea pops off in a major way. If South Korea erupts in revolution, and that really is game over for the United States, because they wouldn't be able to withstand that. It's game over in the region anyway. Irish Partisan says the Tikhonovskaya camp issued their election manifesto shortly before the 2020 election, which basically called for shock therapy economics, mass privatization, but had to hide it due to criticism. Yeah, they'll never stand openly for what they actually stand for. They'll hide behind vague phrases because they can't come out in the open and say, we want to sell the whole country off, asset strip it, and then basically turn it into a military encampment for the usage of US imperialism against Russia. Not many votes in that. Not really. Total Freak says, can you see why I only have 1,500 subs? Yeah, well, I'll take my 1,500 over the millions that watch various other pieces of a reactionary tripe. But then again, I must ask you, Mr. Total Freak, why are you here watching then? Eduardo says, US give up on Europe. The US is doing this for its own selfish aims. They couldn't care less. I think you've misunderstood what I was saying there. It's not that the US cares particularly about the European proletariat. It's that the US chose to back the European ruling classes, both economically and militarily, in 1945, and their power ultimately comes from, or has been guaranteed by, the US military presence and the US economic presence in Europe since 1945. And if the US, for various reasons, withdraws from NATO, for instance, what the European reactionaries are afraid of is that without the US to back them up, that their system in Europe will collapse, and they're afraid of their own domestic proletariat. That's what they're actually afraid of. That's what I was saying there. Hello to YepX, who's come into the chat. And Irish Partisan says, Chinese set up the Stone Park business center here in Minsk and are building a new national stadium as a gift to Belarus. China has also invested heavily in Belarus with Geely cars. Yeah, I also believe that Lukashenko's youngest son is studying in Beijing right now, so there's clearly a big partnership being made here. The Chinese also give Lukashenko a big welcome when he went over there. Like, they treated him with far more respect than they treated Tony Blinken, for instance, which is only fair, which is only correct. Luther says, Jordan Peterson. Well, what do you want me to do with that? Jordan Peterson, never trust a psychologist who cries all the time. Very bad for the therapy sessions to have him bursting into tears. Muzzle Paint, thank you for your generous comment. I will be modest enough not to read it out. Right, okay, I'm going to leave it there for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'll be back again tomorrow at about the same time or slightly later. Thank you, everybody, who's contributed to a very active chat this evening. Be sure to join me on Thursday on Patreon for the Napoleon review. It's going to be a good one. Until then, I'll bid you all adieu.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to